You think that little scar gets you on early? Please." The words cut sharper than the cold airport air conditioning. It wasn't the first time Frank Miller had been judged by someone who didn't know him, but something about this moment hit different. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the smirk. Maybe it was just the casual way she dismissed his Purple Heart license plate as a cheap trick for sympathy. Whatever it was, it dug in deeper than the old shrapnel in his hip ever had. He didn't lash out. He didn't argue. He just looked at her, expression unreadable, and said quietly, "That scar was earned. And no, I don't need sympathy. Just some time to settle in before the rush." The gate agent scoffed, eyes sweeping him from head to toe like she was scanning for proof of pain. "Sir," she said, with that performative politeness that always masked contempt, "pre-boarding is for people who actually need assistance. You're walking just fine. Next in line, please." Frank took a step back as her attention turned to the next passenger, who barely even noticed the exchange. Most people didn't. That's the thing about invisible wounds, they're easy to overlook. Frank didn't limp dramatically. He didn't wear his medals on his sleeve, but his hip ached constantly. Every step a reminder of that explosion decades ago that tore through the ground under his squad and through him. A jungle ambush during a recon mission that few people remembered. Half his team didn't make it out. Frank did, but not whole. Over the years, he got used to the pain, the stiffness, the way his body moved a little slower than it used to. But he never got used to the disrespect, especially when it came from someone who couldn't tell the difference between a combat veteran and a con artist. He wasn't asking for a seat upgrade or special treatment. He wasn't looking for handouts. He had paid for his economy ticket months in advance like everyone else. All he wanted was to board the plane early enough to walk the narrow aisle without a line of impatient people behind him, to settle into his seat without aggravating the lingering damage in his hip. That's it. That was the entire request. But instead, he was treated like a liar, like a man trying to game the system, all because his wounds weren't loud enough, dramatic enough, visible enough. It wasn't just the gate agent's words that stung, it was her face, the disbelief, the assumption that he was pretending, the total lack of curiosity about what he might have endured. She had no idea what it meant to wake up at 3 a.m. because a phantom pain in your hip decided to act up. No clue what it felt like to see a young man in uniform at the airport and suddenly feel both pride and a hollow ache for the friends who never came home. He'd buried those he loved. He carried memories he never wanted, from firefights in places most Americans couldn't point to on a map. And yet, to her, he was just another old man trying to cut in line. The gate area was crowded, and the buzz of conversation barely dipped when she dismissed him. A couple of people looked up, curious, then looked away. No one said anything. Frank stood there for a moment, unsure whether to explain further or just walk away. He had the credentials, a VA-issued ID with a Purple Heart designation, a license plate with the same honor. But it didn't matter. To her, none of it mattered. All she saw was someone trying to board early without a visible excuse. He exhaled slowly, jaw tight, and turned toward the nearest empty chair. Sitting down was a relief, not just for his hip, but for the humiliation that threatened to choke him. He'd been through worse, he reminded himself of that. Much worse. But this wasn't about just him. This felt like an insult to every veteran who came home in pieces, some missing limbs, some carrying trauma in their bones and blood. Dismissing him so easily wasn't just rude, it was ignorant. And it wasn't going to slide without notice. Frank sat in the corner of the gate area, half hidden behind a metal column, the boarding zones being called out one by one over the intercom. Every number felt like a jab. He should have been on the plane already, settled into his seat, stretching out his leg just enough to keep the joint from locking. Instead, he was watching people stroll by, dragging roller bags and sipping overpriced coffee while his hip pulsed like it had its own heartbeat. It wasn't just the physical pain, though that was bad enough. It was the deeper ache, the kind that reminded him he wasn't as young as he used to be. The kind that came not from the jungle firefights or sleepless nights overseas, but from moments like this, quiet, public disrespect, wrapped in polite indifference. It was funny how humiliation could sit heavier than a loaded pack, how it settled into the chest like weight you couldn't shrug off. He glanced around, trying not to meet anyone's eye. He didn't want pity, didn't need a stranger to come over and say, "I'm sorry about what she said." That wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't erase the fact that a woman who'd never worn a uniform or spent a night in a war zone had just dismissed decades of sacrifice with a smirk and a snide comment. What cut deepest was how common it was. Maybe not always this obvious, but always there. The moments when people assumed he was fine because he didn't have a cane, because his spine was still mostly straight, because he didn't wear his service like a badge on his chest. But just because he carried it quietly didn't mean it wasn't heavy. The truth was, he carried it every day. Memories flashed uninvited, sudden, brutal. The blast, the heat, the confusion, the sound of screaming that wasn't his, the way dirt and blood smelled the same when you were fighting to breathe. He blinked hard, pushing it away. That was years ago, a lifetime. But some days it felt like yesterday, especially days like this. He looked down at his phone. For a second, he considered just walking out of the airport and calling it, skipping the reunion, skipping the flight. Let them gather without him this year. He doubted anyone would fault him. But the thought of not seeing his old unit, the guys who did understand, who never questioned each other's scars, seen or unseen, that wasn't an option. Not after everything. No, he wouldn't let one person's ignorance keep him from honoring the ones who didn't make it back. Frank took a breath, steadied himself, and tapped open the airline's website. Buried in the menu options was a feedback form. It wasn't his style to complain. He hated that word, complain. Veterans were trained to endure, not to write messages to customer service. But this wasn't about getting a free voucher or making someone feel bad. This was about accountability. It was about making sure the next vet, the next guy with a limp and a hidden scar, didn't get treated like a fraud because his pain didn't come with crutches or a dramatic backstory. He tapped out a message, methodical, precise. He included his flight number, the gate, the name on the badge of the agent, Brenda, and explained clearly what happened. He didn't embellish, he didn't need to. The facts were enough. He finished the note and hesitated for a second before hitting send. Then he pressed it. Done. No fireworks. No guarantee anyone would even read it before the plane took off. But it was something. A line in the sand. A quiet protest. It was the same instinct that kept him going during the war. You don't leave things unchecked. You don't let the wrong thing slide because it's easier than fighting it. You speak up, even if it's just with a few lines typed into a feedback form, because someone has to. Because silence doesn't fix a damn thing. The intercom called Zone 1, then Zone 2. Frank stayed seated, waiting for his number, his hips stiffening with each passing minute. He gritted his teeth, flexing his foot to keep circulation going, his leg feeling like concrete. The email was out there now, floating in some corporate inbox. That was all he could do, for now. But he wasn't done, not by a long shot. As Zone 3 was called, the routine continued like nothing had happened. Travelers lined up with tired eyes and crumpled boarding passes, moving in a slow shuffle toward the jet bridge. Families wrangled toddlers, business types stared at their phones, and Brenda, the gate agent, who had just publicly humiliated a decorated veteran, carried on without a flicker of remorse. She hadn't looked Frank's way since she'd dismissed him. To her, he was a closed chapter, just another customer to brush off and forget. But something was different now. Somewhere in the back-end systems of the airline, his message had triggered a chain reaction, one that didn't rely on a corporate form letter or an empty apology. 5 minutes after Frank hit send, the jet bridge door creaked open, but not for passengers. Instead, the flight's captain stepped out into the terminal, her presence slicing through the noise like a sudden shift in air pressure. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't come out because of a technical issue or a delay. She came out looking for someone. Her eyes scanned the rows of seats and finally landed on the man sitting quietly in the corner, his posture rigid, hands clasped tightly over his knee. She walked straight toward him, her step steady, her face calm but focused with intent. Passengers took notice. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People in line turned, wondering what was happening. Brenda paused mid-swipe at her terminal, a flicker of unease breaking through her polished smile. Frank looked up, unsure what was coming next. The captain stood in front of him and spoke, her voice carrying across the gate area, unmistakably clear and full of quiet command. "Sergeant Frank Miller?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He nodded, a little taken aback. "Yes, ma'am." She stood tall and rendered a crisp military salute, not for show, not for drama, but with the precision of someone who understood exactly what it meant. She held it for a moment, steady and unflinching, before dropping her arm. "Sergeant," she said, "it has come to my attention that you were disrespected by a representative of this airline. I want you to know, personally and professionally, that this is not acceptable. Not under my command. Not today. Not ever." Her voice didn't waver. Her words weren't rehearsed. They came from a place that Frank instantly recognized: integrity. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she added, "I have the honor of flying this aircraft today, but I won't be sitting in my assigned seat. That seat, 1A, is now yours." Gasps rippled through the gate. People weren't used to seeing real accountability, not like this: a pilot giving up their own seat. A public correction delivered not with shame, but with dignity. It felt rare. It felt right. Brenda's face turned a shade paler with every word. She opened her mouth but said nothing. The authority in the captain's presence left no space for rebuttal. Frank blinked, stunned. For a moment, all he could do was stand. A breath caught in his throat, but not from pain. From something deeper, an emotion he hadn't expected to feel today. Validation. Respect, not just for him, but for every brother-in-arms who'd come home carrying more than they ever talked about. "Ma'am, I don't want to take your seat," he said, his voice low, steady, humble. The captain shook her head once. "It's not a gift, Sergeant. It's the smallest measure of respect for someone who has given more than most people will ever understand. You've earned it 10 times over." She turned to Brenda without softening. "Please issue Sergeant Miller a new boarding pass for seat 1A, and ensure his luggage is moved accordingly." Her tone had changed. Warmth turned to command. There was no debate, no back and forth. Brenda stammered something inaudible and began typing, her hands moving faster than before, no longer with smug efficiency, but with flustered urgency. The air in the gate area had shifted entirely. Everyone had heard what was said. Everyone had seen what just happened. This wasn't a small moment anymore. It was something larger. The captain turned back to Frank. "If you'll allow me," she said gently, offering her arm, "I'd be honored to escort you on board." He hesitated only a second before nodding and taking her arm, his pride not diminished by the gesture, but lifted. As they walked toward the jet bridge, heads turned. Not out of curiosity now, but out of respect. There was something solemn about the way they moved together, one in uniform, the other carrying years of silent service. And in that walk, down that narrow hallway of aluminum and steel, the story of a man nearly dismissed was rewritten by someone who chose to stand when everyone else stayed seated. The jet bridge was quiet, almost reverent, as Frank and the captain walked side by side. Each step was slow and deliberate, not because he needed help walking, though the pain in his hip had grown sharper with the delay, but because the moment carried weight. The kind of weight Frank hadn't felt in years, not since a folded flag had been placed in his hands, not since he stood at the cemetery with medals pinned to his chest, but friends missing at his side. The sound of rolling luggage and the usual boarding chatter faded behind them. All that remained was the soft echo of shoes on metal, the steady presence of a woman who saw what others didn't. They reached the aircraft door where a flight attendant waited, already informed, already prepared. She greeted Frank with a quiet smile that said more than words could. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant Miller," she said, gesturing toward the front of the plane. "Your seat is just here." And what a seat it was, wide, cushioned, with legroom he hadn't seen since before airlines started shrinking everything but the price tag. He moved carefully, trying not to show just how much effort it took to bend, to sit, to ease into the comfort he didn't expect, but now couldn't deny needing. The captain lingered for a moment before she returned to the cockpit. "We'll be wheels up shortly," she said. "But before we go, I wanted to say this isn't about pity or public relations. It's about setting things right. My father served. He taught me what honor looks like. You showed up today not asking for applause, just a little space to breathe, and instead you were insulted. That's not going to happen on my flight, not while I have anything to say about it." With that, she nodded once and disappeared through the cockpit door, leaving Frank with a heart heavy, but this time in a different way. As he settled in, passengers filed by. Some glanced his way and nodded. A few paused to whisper quiet words of appreciation. One younger man, maybe mid-30s, paused long enough to say, "Thank you for your service, sir, and I'm sorry for how she treated you. That wasn't right." Frank just nodded. He didn't need an apology from strangers, but the acknowledgement, that mattered. The flight attendant brought him water, checked if he needed anything, and returned minutes later with a small envelope from the captain. Inside was a handwritten note. "To Sergeant Frank Miller, for your service, your sacrifice, and your unshakable dignity. Seat 1A belongs to you today. It's the least we can do." Frank stared at the note for a long time. He didn't cry. He rarely did. Marines don't cry, not in public, not if they can help it. But his throat tightened and his jaw clenched. This wasn't just a first-class upgrade. It wasn't about luxury. It was about being seen, about being valued, even after all these years. He hadn't worn his uniform in decades, but today someone had looked past the surface and saluted the man underneath. The engines began to hum and the plane started to taxi. Frank glanced out the window, the landscape rolling by, but his thoughts were a million miles away. Not on the war, not on the pain, but on the pilot who gave up her seat without hesitation, on the people who chose to do the right thing when no one was watching, on how rare that kind of leadership had become and how much it still mattered. As the plane lifted into the sky, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because the flight was comfortable, but because for once someone had stood up for him, not with words but with action, and that, more than any medal, reminded him why he'd served in the first place, not for recognition, but for people like her, people who still understood what honor looks like, even when no one's keeping score. The flight to San Diego passed not just in miles but in moments Frank hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the plush seat or the warm towel or the unobtrusive clink of glassware that made it special. It was the silence, the kind that came not from being alone, but from being understood. A silence that soothed, that allowed him to close his eyes without tension, without feeling the need to keep watch over his shoulder. There was no spotlight, no speech, no fanfare, just comfort, just space to breathe and remember without bitterness. Every so often the flight attendant checked in, never lingering, never making him feel like a spectacle. She brought him a meal he hadn't expected, addressed him by name each time she spoke, and at one point quietly slipped him a second note, shorter than the first. It read, "You've got allies in the air, Sergeant, always." Somewhere over the southwest, cruising at 35,000 feet, Frank stared out the window and let himself recall names, faces, laughs that echoed through jungle fog and desert heat. Friends he hadn't seen in years, some he'd never see again, and yet there they were, right beside him in spirit. That plane wasn't just carrying him to San Diego, it was carrying a legacy of lives linked by sacrifice, stitched together by memory, and held up now by the unexpected kindness of a pilot who had never met him before that day, but had known exactly what to do. When the wheels touched down, the sun was setting over the California coast, casting everything in golden fire. Frank stood slowly, gripping the armrest, easing pressure off his hip before making his way to the front of the aircraft. The captain was waiting just outside the cockpit door. She didn't speak immediately, just gave him a small nod of respect. "Thank you again, Sergeant," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "This airline failed you today, and I can't erase that. But I hope what we did here reminded you that not everyone looks away." Frank looked her in the eye, his own voice thick with something he rarely let show. "You didn't just remind me, you restored something I didn't even know I'd lost." Outside the gate, he retrieved his luggage, now tagged with a priority sticker, neatly placed on top of the cart by a ground crew member who, without being asked, quietly said, "Welcome home, sir." He nodded back, too tired, and moved for more words. Later, while he waited for his ride to the Reunion Hotel, his phone buzzed with a short, unexpected email. It was from the airline's executive office. It thanked him for his feedback, apologized for the incident, confirmed that the gate agent had been suspended pending investigation, and informed him that a new training program on veteran sensitivity and ADA compliance would be launched immediately, with consulting input from multiple veteran advocacy groups. At the bottom was a line that stuck with him. "We didn't just get this wrong. We betrayed the values we claim to stand for. That will not happen again. Frank arrived at the reunion that evening to the sound of laughter, boots stomping the ground in old familiar rhythms, and the quick-fire teasing only old Marines could get away with. Dozens of them, grey-haired, some stooped, others still standing straight as iron rods, greeted him with slaps on the back, jokes, and the kind of embrace that comes from surviving together. When the story eventually came out, because it always does, he didn't embellish it. Didn't talk about the email, the disciplinary action, or the donations the airline quietly made to veteran causes later that week. He simply said, "Pilot gave up her seat, called me sergeant, saluted," and that was enough. His brothers-in-arms grew quiet at that, the kind of quiet that meant everything had been said. A few nodded solemnly. One muttered, "Damn right." Another, voice gruff, said, "About time someone remembered who the hell we are." And then someone cracked a beer and the evening rolled on, stories tumbling out like ammo belts, some funny, some sharp, all real. But beneath the laughter and the ribbing, something had changed. Frank could feel it. Not just in the reunion hall, but in himself. He didn't walk taller, his hip wouldn't let him. But he carried something different now, not a weight, a pride, quiet and steady, because dignity, once dismissed, had been restored not with ceremony, but with action. The story of what happened at that gate would follow him long after the flight. Not because it made the news, it didn't. Not because it went viral, he didn't post a thing. But because the people who mattered knew. And because every time he stepped into another airport or saw a gate agent scanning IDs, he knew there was a chance they'd think twice. Not because they feared being called out, but because they'd been taught to recognize what sacrifice really looks like. And that was worth more than any upgrade. It was legacy. It was justice. And it all began with one man who didn't raise his voice, one captain who refused to look away, and one moment of respect that echoed far beyond a terminal gate.